You saw the headline, but you probably didn't see the real story hiding underneath it. On the surface, this was presented as a decisive geopolitical act framed in the familiar language of strength, deterrence, and strategic necessity. A rapid military move involving Venezuela. A promise of order imposed on chaos. A declaration that energy security would be restored, markets stabilized, and leverage reclaimed. The official version moved quickly, cleanly, and with confidence. It always does. According to that version, the disruption in oil prices that followed was an unfortunate but temporary side effect. Markets, we were told, were simply reacting to uncertainty. Gasoline prices spiked, not because of structural fragility, but because traders dislike surprises. The implication was clear and comforting. Once the situation normalized, prices would settle, supply chains would recalibrate, and the system would return to equilibrium. Nothing fundamental had changed. Nothing deep had been exposed. But that explanation only works if you believe markets behave like neutral instruments, rather than complex systems of incentives, expectations, and silent dependencies. It only works if you assume that oil pricing is driven primarily by barrels in the ground rather than by trust, coordination, and political restraint. And it only works if you ignore how little slack now exists. Inside a global energy system that has been optimized for efficiency, not resilience. What happened after the invasion was not simply a reaction, it was a revelation. Futures. Markets moved before physical supply did. Shipping insurers adjusted risk premiums before a single tanker changed course. Refiners began hedging against disruptions that had not yet materialized but were suddenly plausible. None of this was irrational. It was precautionary behavior inside a system that understands how thin its margins have become. The silence that followed from certain political and media institutions was just as telling as the noise. There was an eagerness to discuss the morality of the action, the optics of leadership, the symbolism of strength. There was far less interest in explaining why a single regional escalation could send ripples through fuel prices thousands of miles away within hours. That question lingered, largely unaddressed, because answering it requires acknowledging how concentrated power and risk have become inside global energy. Markets. The beneficiaries of this structure are not hard to identify. Volatility rewards those positioned to trade it, hedge it, and arbitrage it. Large financial institutions, commodity desks, and vertically integrated energy firms are insulated not by stability, but by scale and optionality. The costs, meanwhile, diffuse outward. They appear at the pump, in transportation budgets, in household inflation figures. They are absorbed by consumers who are told, once again, that this is simply how the market works. Yet markets are not natural phenomena. They are designed environments shaped by policy, decisions, regulatory choices, and geopolitical strategies that prioritize certain forms of power over others. The invasion did not introduce chaos into an otherwise stable system. It exposed how much chaos the system already contains, quietly managed through assumptions that depend on restraint and predictability. And so the question that hangs at the end of this first chapter is not whether gas prices will eventually come down. It is whether a system that reacts this violently to a single political shock was ever as stable as we were led to believe, and what other shocks it can no longer afford. To understand why the reaction was so immediate, you have to look past the spectacle of military movement and into the architecture of modern oil markets. Official statements emphasized physical supply, pointing out that Venezuelan production had already been constrained, that global inventories existed, that alternative sources could compensate on paper. The numbers appeared manageable. In spreadsheets, the system still balanced. but oil is no longer priced primarily on what is being pumped today. It is priced on what might not be pumped tomorrow and on who controls the conditions under which future supply can be trusted. Over the last 2 decades, energy markets have been financialized to a degree that makes physical flow only one variable among many. Expectations, political risk, and narrative credibility now move prices as powerfully as output figures. The invasion inserted a new variable that could not be easily quantified. It raised questions, not only about Venezuela, but about precedent. If a major producer could be subjected to sudden military action under the banner of strategic necessity, then the implicit rules governing energy geopolitics had shifted. Traders understood this immediately because their business depends on anticipating rule changes before they are formally announced. This is where the official explanation begins to collapse. The price spike was not driven by fear of missing barrels in the short term. It was driven by uncertainty about governance in the long term. Shipping routes, contract enforcement, sanctions regimes, and diplomatic back channels all rely on a baseline assumption that conflicts, even hostile ones, follow recognizable patterns. The invasion disrupted that assumption. Insurance markets were among the first to react, quietly recalculating risk premiums for vessels operating anywhere near contested zones. Those higher premiums fed directly into transportation costs, which in turn affected futures pricing. Refiners, especially those configured for heavier crude blends similar to Venezuelan oil, faced new uncertainties about feedstock reliability and began adjusting their positions defensively. None of this required panic. It required caution. What made the situation more fragile was how little excess capacity remained globally. Years of underinvestment driven by political pressure to transition away from fossil fuels without fully replacing their systemic role had left producers with limited buffers. Spare capacity existed, but it was politically concentrated and strategically sensitive. Bringing it online was not a technical decision alone, it was a diplomatic one. This is where silence became policy. Governments that publicly supported the invasion avoided detailed discussions about energy repercussions. Acknowledging them would mean admitting that strategic decisions were being made inside a system with very little margin for error. Media outlets followed a similar pattern, focusing on immediate political narratives rather than structural exposure. The story was framed as volatility, not vulnerability. Meanwhile, the distribution of risk became clearer. Households experienced higher fuel costs almost immediately, long before any measurable supply disruption occurred. Transportation, companies passed along surcharges, food prices began to edge upward, not because of scarcity, but because energy is embedded in every logistical calculation. These were not dramatic shocks. They were incremental pressures, easily dismissed individually, but cumulative in effect. The invasion, in this sense, acted like a stress test that no one officially ordered, but everyone privately observed. It revealed how dependent price stability has become on assumptions of restraint rather than abundance. It showed that markets no longer wait for damage, they price in the possibility of it. And as this chapter closes, an uncomfortable question emerges. If the mere anticipation of disorder can move prices this decisively, what happens when disorder is no longer hypothetical, and how many political decisions are now constrained by a system that reacts before consequences fully unfold? What made the shock particularly destabilizing was not just its speed, but its asymmetry. The invasion was framed as a controlled assertion of power, yet the economic consequences unfolded in directions that power could not easily manage. This is the paradox that sits at the core of modern geopolitics. Military dominance does not automatically translate into market control, especially in systems that have been deliberately globalized, financialized, and fragmented. Oil markets no longer respond primarily to the intentions of states, but to the credibility of systems. When credibility fractures, even briefly, coordination begins to fail. Long-term, contracts are still honored, tankers still move, refineries still operate, but everyone involved starts adjusting behavior at the margins. Those marginal adjustments are where instability accumulates. One of the least discussed consequences of the invasion was its impact on informal coordination mechanisms that rarely appear in official documents. Energy markets rely heavily on quiet signaling between governments, producers, and financial institutions. These signals are not binding agreements. They are understandings about what will not be done, about which lines will not be crossed, about how disputes will be managed without escalation. They are the connective tissue of a system that pretends to run on competition but survives on restraint. By acting outside those expectations, the invasion introduced doubt into that informal architecture. It suggested that strategic energy assets could become instruments of direct force rather than negotiation. Even countries far removed from Venezuela began reassessing their exposure, not because they expected invasion, but because they recognized that predictability itself had become conditional. Markets responded accordingly. Capital began to favor assets that could tolerate volatility rather than efficiency. This shift was subtle, almost invisible in daily headlines, but profound in its implications. Investments flowed toward companies with diversified supply chains, access to political influence, and the ability to absorb regulatory shocks. Smaller players, regional refiners, and logistics firms found themselves increasingly vulnerable, squeezed between rising costs and limited pricing power. Workers, as usual, occupied the least protected position in this adjustment: energy sector. Employment did not collapse overnight, but conditions tightened. Overtime was reduced in some regions. Temporary contracts were delayed or canceled. Downstream industries, particularly transportation and manufacturing, began quietly preparing for demand. Slowdowns driven by higher input costs. These were preemptive moves, justified internally as prudence, but felt externally as insecurity. What remained conspicuously absent from public discussion was any serious interrogation of responsibility. When gas prices rise after a geopolitical shock, blame is often diffused into abstraction. The market did it. The crisis did it. No single decision appears accountable. Yet, every structural vulnerability exposed by the invasion was the result of deliberate policy. Choices made over decades, choices to concentrate production, to prioritize short-term returns, to treat energy as both a strategic asset and a speculative instrument. The discomfort this creates explains the reluctance to dwell on structure. It is easier to debate the righteousness of action than the fragility of the system that action destabilizes. It is easier to promise eventual normalization than to admit that normalization now depends on an increasingly narrow set of assumptions holding indefinitely. As this chapter draws to a close, the tension sharpens. If power can initiate disruption but cannot control its economic trajectory, then who is actually governing the system, and how many more shocks can it absorb before precaution becomes paralysis? As the immediate market response settled into a new, uneasy baseline, a different dynamic began to surface, one that rarely receives sustained attention because it unfolds slowly and without spectacle. Policy recalibration. Not the kind announced at press conferences or debated in legislatures, but the quiet internal adjustments made by governments, central banks, and regulatory bodies once they recognize that an external shock is no longer transient. The invasion forced these institutions to confront a contradiction they have spent years trying to manage discreetly. Energy policy, in theory, is supposed to be transitioning away from oil dependency. In practice, fiscal stability, inflation control, and political legitimacy still rely heavily on predictable energy costs. When oil volatility increases, that contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Central banks were among the first to feel the pressure. Rising fuel prices fed directly into inflation expectations, not because oil dominates consumption baskets, but because it acts as a multiplier. Transportation costs seep into everything wage demands respond not to. Abstract inflation metrics, but to lived expenses. Monetary authorities understood that even a modest, sustained increase in energy prices could undermine carefully calibrated interest rate strategies. Yet tightening policy in response to an energy-driven shock risks compounding the damage. Higher rates slow investment and employment, but they do nothing to increase oil supply or restore geopolitical predictability. Loosening policy, on the other hand, risks entrenching inflation at a moment when public tolerance for cost of living pressures is already thin. The invasion did not cause this dilemma. It exposed it. Governments faced a parallel constraint. Strategic petroleum reserves were discussed publicly as a potential stabilizer, but their use revealed another uncomfortable truth. These reserves are designed for supply disruptions, not credibility crises. Releasing oil into a market reacting to political uncertainty can dampen prices temporarily, but it does not address the underlying fear that future disruptions are becoming more likely, not less. Behind closed doors, energy importing nations began reassessing alliances and dependencies. Not dramatically, not in ways that would register as policy shifts in the short term, but incrementally. Procurement strategies were reviewed. Long-term contracts were scrutinized for flexibility rather than cost efficiency. Diplomatic language softened in some arenas and hardened in others, reflecting a recalculation of risk that could not be openly acknowledged without signaling weakness. Energy exporting countries watched closely. Some benefited from higher prices without taking any action at all. Others recognized an opportunity to extract concessions, knowing that buyers now valued reliability over rhetoric. The invasion altered bargaining power not by changing who controlled resources, but by changing how fragile access to those resources appeared. What remained absent was any comprehensive public accounting of these shifts. Citizens were told to expect volatility, to understand that global events have consequences, to be patient. They were not told that the system absorbing those consequences had already been stretched by years of optimization, financial leverage, and political avoidance. They were not told that resilience had been treated as an inefficiency and that the bill for that decision was now arriving in small, persistent increments. The media's role in this phase was largely passive. Coverage tracked prices, quoted officials, and moved on. The deeper story, how institutions were quietly adapting to a more unstable energy order, rarely surfaced because it lacked a single moment of rupture. It was a story of adjustments rather than events, of constraints tightening rather than breaking. And so this chapter ends with a question that policymakers themselves seemed reluctant to articulate publicly. If every tool available mitigates symptoms rather than causes, and if credibility itself has become a scarce resource, then what happens when the next shock arrives before this one has fully faded, and who will be expected to absorb that cost? As the external effects of the invasion continued to ripple outward, a more subtle transformation began to take place inside the political economy itself. This was not about prices alone, but about behavior. Systems under repeated stress do not simply fluctuate, they adapt. And the way they adapt often reveals priorities that official narratives prefer to keep obscured. Corporations across energy-intensive sectors began revising assumptions that had long been treated as stable. Forecast models were adjusted to include a higher baseline of geopolitical disruption. Capital expenditures were delayed or redirected, not because demand had collapsed, but because predictability had. Investment committees became less concerned with optimizing returns under normal conditions and more focused on surviving abnormal ones. This shift while rational at the firm level carried collective consequences. When capital becomes cautious, growth slows unevenly. Large firms with diversified exposure can absorb uncertainty, hedge it, and even profit from it. Smaller firms cannot. They face higher borrowing costs, reduced access to insurance, and thinner margins that leave little room for error. Over time, this dynamic accelerates consolidation. Market power concentrates not because of innovation or efficiency, but because instability rewards scale. Labor markets reflected this change in quiet ways. Employers avoided long-term commitments, favoring flexibility over security. Hiring slowed, not dramatically, but persistently. Workers felt the impact not as sudden unemployment, but as stagnation, fewer opportunities, slower wage growth, reduced bargaining power. The invasion did not create these conditions, but it reinforced them, adding another justification for caution in a system already inclined toward it. Politically, this adaptation posed a challenge that few leaders were eager to confront openly. Public discourse tends to frame economic pain as temporary, resolvable through patience or resilience. Structural adaptation, however, implies permanence. It suggests that higher volatility is not an episode, but a feature of the environment going forward. Admitting that would require explaining why past assurances of stability were overconfident, if not misleading. The energy transition narrative became increasingly strained under this pressure. Official commitments to decarbonization remained intact rhetorically, but investment behavior told a more complex story. Volatility made long-term planning harder, not easier. Projects that depended on stable regulatory and pricing assumptions faced new hurdles. At the same time, short-term reliance on fossil fuels deepened as governments prioritized immediate stability over long-term transformation. This contradiction created a feedback loop. The more uncertain the geopolitical environment became, the more difficult it was to accelerate structural change. The more difficult structural change became, the more dependent economies remained on fragile energy systems. Each shock reinforced the conditions for the next. What was rarely discussed was who bore responsibility for managing this loop. Political leaders framed themselves as responders to external forces rather than participants in system design. Markets were portrayed as neutral arbiters rather than amplifiers of risk. The result was a diffusion of accountability that left no clear locus for reform, only a series of reactive measures that treated symptoms while entrenching underlying vulnerabilities. By this stage, the invasion's significance had shifted. It was no longer primarily an event in foreign policy or military strategy. It had become a reference point in economic planning, a data point embedded in models that assumed a more unstable future. Its impact was now institutionalized, not dramatic, but persistent. And as this chapter closes, a deeper unease emerges. If systems adapt to instability by concentrating power, reducing security, and normalizing volatility, then the question is no longer whether markets will recover, but what kind of economy is being quietly built in the shadow of repeated shocks, and who it is ultimately designed to protect. By the time the invasion receded from the front pages, its most consequential effects were already migrating into places that headlines rarely reach: balance sheets, risk models, regulatory language drafted in technical terms and approved with minimal public scrutiny. This is where systemic change tends to settle, long after the sense of urgency has dissipated. Financial institutions adjusted first, not because they were alarmist, but because they are structurally obligated to respond to perceived risk. Credit conditions tightened selectively. Energy-dependent industries faced more stringent lending criteria, while speculative capital flowed toward instruments designed to profit from volatility itself. Derivatives tied to energy prices expanded in volume and complexity, offering hedges that also amplified interconnectedness. This expansion created a paradox. On the one hand, risk appeared to be managed more thoroughly, distributed across sophisticated financial products. On the other, the system became more sensitive to disruption. When risk is sliced, packaged, and traded, it does not disappear. It moves often toward actors least equipped to understand its full implications. The invasion accelerated this process by validating the assumption that geopolitical shocks were no longer exceptional. Regulators found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Publicly, they emphasized vigilance and stability. Privately, they faced pressure to avoid actions that might further unsettle markets. Stricter oversight could constrain liquidity, looser oversight could invite excess. In a system already strained by uncertainty, either choice carried costs. The path of least resistance was incremental adjustment, framed as technical refinement rather than structural reform. International coordination, long presented as a stabilizing force in energy markets, showed signs of fatigue. Multilateral forums continued to meet issue statements and affirm shared goals. But behind the language of cooperation, national priorities asserted themselves more clearly. Energy security was reinterpreted through a narrower lens, emphasizing autonomy over integration, resilience over efficiency, control over openness. This shift did not manifest as abrupt disengagement. It appeared in procurement clauses, in export controls, in subtle changes to sanction enforcement. Each move was defensible in isolation. Collectively, they signaled a retreat from the assumption that global systems could be governed primarily through mutual trust and shared norms. For consumers, these developments were largely invisible, yet deeply consequential. Price fluctuations became more frequent, less predictable. Budgeting for energy costs required greater tolerance for uncertainty. Political messaging urged patience and understanding, but offered little clarity about duration or direction. The implicit social contract that efficiency and globalization would deliver stability felt increasingly fragile. Media attention during this phase shifted elsewhere, as it often does. New crises emerged. New narratives competed for focus. The invasion became a reference point rather than a subject, cited occasionally to explain residual volatility, but no longer interrogated in depth. Its role as a catalyst for structural change faded from view, even as its effects continued to accumulate. What lingered was a sense of unresolved tension. Systems had adjusted, but not necessarily improved. Risks had been reallocated, but not reduced. Authority had shifted quietly, without democratic deliberation or explicit consent. And so this chapter ends with a question that resists easy resolution. If the most lasting consequences of political decisions emerge only after attention has moved on, and if those consequences reshape systems in ways few openly debate, then how much of the future is being decided in silence, and who, if anyone, is accountable for the architecture taking shape? What ultimately distinguishes this moment from previous episodes of energy-driven disruption is not the scale of the shock, but the erosion of narrative control that followed it. For decades, political and economic systems relied on a shared story to legitimize volatility. That short-term pain was the price of long-term stability, that markets would correct, that institutions remained fundamentally in command. The invasion strained that story without fully replacing it. Public trust does not collapse all at once. It thins. It becomes conditional. Consumers notice that explanations arrive late and feel incomplete. Workers notice that flexibility is always demanded of them. While protection remains abstract, investors notice that political risk is no longer peripheral, but central to valuation. None of these observations require ideological commitment. They emerge from experience. Inside governments, this thinning trust manifested as caution, not prudence, but hesitancy. Decisions were delayed, language softened, commitments hedged. The invasion had demonstrated that decisive action could carry diffuse, uncontrollable economic consequences leaders became more aware of how little room for error remained, even as public expectations for control persisted. This gap between expectation and capacity widened quietly. The media's role in this phase became increasingly ambiguous. Investigative energy gave way to normalization. Volatility was treated as background noise rather than a signal. Coverage focused on managing perceptions rather than interrogating structures. The result was not overt misinformation, but omission. The absence of sustained inquiry allowed adaptation to proceed without contestation. Meanwhile, alternative narratives gained traction at the margins. Some framed the instability as proof that globalization had failed. Others argued it demonstrated the necessity of even greater central control. These interpretations diverged politically, but shared a common assumption that the system itself was no longer self-justifying. It required explanation, defense, or replacement. What was rarely acknowledged was that the system had not broken. It had functioned exactly as designed. It transferred risk downward. It insulated scale. It rewarded those positioned to navigate complexity. The invasion did not disrupt this logic. It reinforced it by exposing who could absorb shocks and who could not. Energy in this context was never just about fuel. It was a medium through which power circulated between states, markets, institutions, and individuals. Control over energy meant influence over inflation, employment, and political legitimacy. The invasion altered the flow of that influence not by redistributing resources, but by intensifying uncertainty around them. As this chapter closes, the unresolved tension sharpens further. If instability no longer undermines the system, but instead becomes the condition under which it consolidates power, then what incentive exists to restore genuine stability, and who would lose if that stability ever returned? By the time the full implications of the invasion began to register, the language used to describe the situation had subtly shifted. What was once called disruption was now framed as adjustment. What had been volatility became normalization. This change in vocabulary mattered because it signaled acceptance, not resolution, but accommodation. The system was no longer trying to return to a previous state. It was learning how to operate under permanent strain. Energy prices, while no longer surging daily, remained elevated enough to recalibrate expectations. Governments stopped promising relief and began emphasizing adaptation. Households were encouraged to plan differently, consume differently, commute differently. None of these recommendations were unreasonable in isolation. Together, they implied a quiet transfer of responsibility away from the structures that produced instability and toward individuals expected to manage its consequences. Markets absorbed this shift efficiently. Volatility was priced in. Risk premiums became structural. Investment strategies evolved around uncertainty rather than against it. In this environment, predictability itself became a form of privilege, available primarily to actors large enough to internalize risk or externalize cost. Stability did not disappear. It concentrated. What remained striking was how rarely the invasion itself was revisited as a subject of accountability. Its role in accelerating these dynamics was acknowledged indirectly, if at all. Political discourse moved on, not because the questions had been answered, but because sustained attention threatened to expose limits that institutions preferred not to confront. The focus returned to management, optics, and narrative containment. The deeper issue was never Venezuela alone, nor oil alone, nor even the decision to use force. It was the revelation that modern systems of power depend less on control than on tolerance. Tolerance for instability, for diffuse harm, for outcomes that no single actor fully governs. The invasion illuminated how thin the boundary had become between strategic action and systemic consequence. In this sense, the most unsettling outcome was not economic, it was conceptual. The idea that complex systems could be steered decisively without triggering unintended cascades, appeared increasingly fragile. Authority persisted, but confidence eroded. Decisions were still made, but with an awareness that their effects would travel farther, faster, and less predictably than before. Nothing in the aftermath suggested collapse. Supply chains continued to function. Markets continued to trade. Institutions continued to operate. That continuity itself became the quiet justification for inaction. If the system was still standing, the logic went, then the costs must be acceptable. Yet beneath that logic lay an unresolved tension. A system that survives by absorbing shock rather than reducing it does not eliminate risk. It reallocates it. And as that reallocation becomes normalized, the distance between decision and consequence grows wider, harder to trace, and easier to deny. So the story does not end with prices stabilizing or headlines fading. It ends with a question that remains deliberately unanswered. If power can initiate events whose consequences disperse beyond accountability, and if markets can normalize instability faster than institutions can explain it, then what exactly is being governed and how much uncertainty is now built into the future by design rather than accident?